G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far you are having a fantastic weekend. Now, I have been AWOL for a few days because of course you may be aware that I'm coming off the back end of my 6th round and my 6th month of chemotherapy. So today, if you notice that sometimes I get a bit confused, I struggle for some words or anything like that, please just bear with me. Chemo fog really does affect your brain regardless of the chemo, but this chemo that I'm taking is specifically targeting a tumour inside of my brain. Now, is this chemo working or not? Well, I don't know. Tomorrow at about midday, I will go in an MRI machine. I'll be in there for about an hour. I'll have the scans, and then Wednesday, around midday, but neurosurgeons, their time they say to come in is all over the place. I will then give you guys results on that, and it'll be interesting to find out. But what I want to say from me is what makes a channel is the audience, and you guys have changed my life in so many ways, publicly, personally. I've met some of you guys who I've met, we go now for coffees with every couple of weeks. So I massively appreciate that. I appreciate your support. I appreciate you sticking with me through this period where I know that my content does struggle. I struggle to make videos. I struggle to get what I mean out. And of course, there's just time off. So thank you for all of that. Regardless of if you're a critic or a lover, it's improved me massively. So thank you. But legends, of course, as always, there is a lot to go over. We'll be looking at the maps. We also have a month roundup for May, and this tells us a lot about the momentum on the front line. There's also been a train, then have a bridge collapse on top of it. Was it from an explosion? Was it from weight of a truck? Was it both? Was it an opportunity for weight on top of that bridge for an IED? Well, we'll talk about what we know so far. And something which a lot of people get it stuck into me about is my critique of the European Union. Now, I think I'm probably not critical enough of some of the issues there, but we will be going over today looking at how much is the EU buying from Russia versus how much are they actually giving to Ukraine? What hurt are they willing to put on themselves to try and have a victory in Ukraine? Because this is one of the biggest things I've been going on about, is it seems like, well, we'll give away this, but we're still going to buy then the enemy's product en masse. So we have a lot to go, and of course we'll look at the maps, and we have an unbelievable amount of maps to go over too. So let's quickly start with this train. So there's two stories coming out here. One is saying that there was an IED conducted by either recruited agents by Ukrainian security services or by Ukrainian security services themselves, and blew up an IED on this road bridge here onto the top of this civilian train here, on basically the front of it, that has so far killed several people, and I believe about 40 are in critical condition. But then the other story here is, no, there was just a semi-trailer, a lorry like this, crossing, and that weight has then brought down the bridge. And at this point in time, it is actually impossible to know which one of these is true. And to be fair, it's likely in the future we won't actually know, but it could be both of this as well. If you've set up a munition and you wait for a heavy weight to cross, then if it's come up at an opportune time, maybe you clack it then and it goes down. Again, I don't know. I'm just trying to present you guys what I am seeing. But what we do know is in the recent days, there has been a lot of Ukrainian sabotage on Russian rail lines. So I've got a few here. 31st of May in Melitopol district, Ukrainian partisans have taken responsibility for blowing up a train and freight and fuel tankers, so 31st of May. And then we have sabotage on Donetsk Oblast. I believe this was, June 1, so in Donetsk. Now, there was a bit of me that thought these two may have been the same, but Melitopol is in Zap. And then we have back on May the 26th, the damage reports runs over an explosive device in Belgorod Oblast. So there's a lot of attacking of trains. But I know one thing about warfare is as war goes from maneuver to attritional to then protracted attritional war, what we see throughout history is we see that tactics get more brutal and self-imposed restrictions then get thrown out of the window. Historically, let's look at unrestricted submarine warfare, use of gas, firebombing of cities. So those restrictions, as it goes on, they just erode away. And it will erode away, especially in attritional warfare, as I've spoken about that bankruptcy theory, as you get more and more desperate, that one side will have to inevitably grow more desperate, and those actions, that imposition of restrictions, will erode away with that desperation as well. And this is the Russian claim around the bridge in Bryansk that is being said. And like I said, it could be both. It could be a horrible accident due to poor construction. It could be an ID with a weight load on top of it. We'll wait for more information. But again, this will be ignored or barely even questioned. What we did see is an S, I can't say the word, but you're holding the bomb, an SIED, took out a Russian commander that led to airstrikes in Mariupol. And this leads into, as we see war go on, we'll see it get more and more brutal. And I think we will see targeting of people working in the informational space as well, due to the importance of information and support to countries in war as well. Wait out on that. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, here we have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, the red check that you see on this map, those are gains made over the previous 24 hours, but we've missed, say, 96 hours. So I'll be going back over those maps and showing you. But what everyone loves to speak about is they love to speak about linear warfare because it suits their narrative. Now, if you have a really big day, it suits your narrative of we'll be in Moscow or Kyiv in a week. If you have a really shit day or a shit week, I mean, it is plus or minus of gains, you can then say it'll take 50 million years. So by the time the dinosaurs are back, Russia will be in Lviv. Now, what we know is warfare, especially attritional warfare, is not linear whatsoever. And this is what we try and do. I try and give you this chart. This shows the occupied kilometre squares change. And what we can do is have a look at the momentum on the front line, and then we can go back to the month before and have a look at what similar conditions were as far as then weather. So what we see here is that May was the largest month since then December last year. So we can see an increase in this. A lot of this has to do with Kursk, which is probably still underreported, but we can also see an increase of 120, 130 kilometre squares from May in 2024 as well. And what this tells you is this is not telling you that the Russians are completely out of momentum, that the warfare is stagnant. This should be very, very concerning. So wait out on Warmapper and AMK map. Likely it will be larger than that, but this tells us a lot about that movement, and I expect that these next few months will be larger as the conditions on the ground will be more optimal to have then offensive ground warfare, as we see throughout 24. Okay, so wait out on this. Now, something I spoke about, I believe in my last video, was one of the biggest things that could change this war in a lot of ways is mass production of Garand drones. We've seen Ukraine and Russia mass producing drones, but we're hearing numbers from the Western media claiming that Russia is going to get their Garand capacity to 500 to 1,000 a day. And what I said is, well, there's not enough strategic targets for all of those. We may see them then more being used like a mid-range a mid-range drone, not an FPV, a mid-range drone. Now, I know it's not the first time you've seen this, but I wanted to show you this. So if we come into then the Pokrovsk sector, and then we have Dobropilya, we see, I'll then bring up this is what I prepared before, open up the oven. We have just to then the west of Dobropilya, but 19.5 kilometres away from the closest Russian line, we see this geolocated footage here of a Russian Garand 2 striking said to be a Ukrainian ammo depot here in then these, they look like hangars, but I'm guessing it is for storage of wheat or grain or something. I could be incorrect there, but I do believe we'll start seeing more and more of these drones working on the front line. And this is what I always say about warfare, is you can't have everything strategic or everything tactical. It has to be a healthy mix of both. And what I look at drones in the moment is I think Ukraine has an unhealthy mix of strategic only strikes into Moscow, into air bases. I'm not saying that's not important, but that needs to happen simultaneously and successive with tactical operations, both drone, armour, infantry, arty, whatever, right on the front line too. It can't be one or the other. Again, with any strategic strikes, it's nearly impossible to actually get an idea of what effect those had. But let's actually have a look then at the maps. And where we're going to come is between Kursk, Russia, Sumy, Ukraine. And this map, this looks substantially different to when I saw you last. And today we see a large advancement by this map of around, say, 5 kilometres. But let's go in, let's step back a couple of days. Now, this is what we saw on the 29th, the day that I was too unwell to make a video. We saw a large movement all the way down to Luknia, to Bilavody, which is still, remember, we saw a Russian flag here, so it's still further out than this. But remember that one of my guys on the ground said, well, I'm engaging guys in Konstantinivka and Volodymyrivka as well. So this has moved now into grey zone, so confirming exactly what he told me. So we've gone from that and then onto this that we see today with 109 kilometre squares, at least in red occupied. I think it's probably substantially more than this. And let's have a look at Suryak. Now, Suryak, he is very, very reliable. Sumy front, last 48 hours, Russian army took full control over Vodolahi and crossed the border, new axis, over Konstantinivka too. Remember, Konstantinivka, where my friend was telling me that he was engaging dudes. Now, furthermore, day 191, Russian army made new advances south of Bilavody. So Bilavody here, continue pushing down at the part of Yanakivka. And in addition, the month of May, Russian forces secured completely the section of the border with Kursk northwest of Gornal. So he's saying that out from Gornal, in these areas in here, that Russia has pushed all of this back. Just wait out on that. I don't know if Ukraine still hold any territory over in Russia at this point. I think it's likely that they do, but it would be very, very minimal. But again, we see this continue pushing in the direction of Yanakivka in here. And this is all part of that buffer zone that we've heard Putin wants to make. And then we see today, in the last 2 days, Russian army intensified military operations to create a buffer zone, control over a series of positions between Oleshnia, Bilavody, Luknia, Vodolahi. And you can just see on these, Bilavody, Oleksivkia, Konstantinivkia, Luknia, you can see where all this is then moving, and we can compare these two, and this is dramatically different. If we can zoom out just a little bit to get an idea that all the way from back really where my cursor is here, across to Yanakivkia and then right down past Oleksivkia, you can see that this is becoming a real problem. And again, weighed out on how large this is, but we know there is definitely movement in those directions shown from different sources of maps. So we can confirm movement. How much we don't know. Realistically, I think it's more like what the grey zone is showing here. There is the least amount of incentive of anywhere on the front line to show movement here for the Russian forces due to the cost, the risk, and the loss of Ukraine's Kursk operation. Remember, Kursk operation was said, to paraphrase Zelensky, when the time comes, this will be used to swap back for Russian territory, and that is now all but gone. Not only gone, overall, Kursk, in every measure that I take, was a net negative operation. I don't think there was positives to come from it. Have those positives outweighed the negative? In my opinion, no. Then we're going to come just to the east, but remaining in the north, we come down into Vovchansk. Now, we did see some movement on the eastern side here the other day, but I showed you too that there was MLRS working in the centre of Vovchansk, which to me tells there's going to be soon ground operations. Keep on that for a sec. Suryak, he's claiming all the way up to the waterway in here that the Russians now control. Again, this doesn't look like a city anymore. This looks like what the Israelis have done throughout Gaza. It is just completely destroyed absolutely everywhere. Now, I'm going to do a video on that and how my opinion and all that is changing on that situation. But I need to feel better because I want to do it well. Now, we're going to remain in the north, but just push further east again. We'll call this whole area the Kupiansk front. But what we see, and we reported the other day, that in Stroivka, that there's now grey zone being shown here, but Suryak said that the Russians had crossed into this area. And we did say this new axis, this is very dangerous due to where it is in this entire Kharkiv front. Now, what we see today is have a look at this geolocation. This geolocation is out in about this sector in here. There's just some small houses and stuff in here. We see what we see. First in the footage, and I believe this is probably chronological, Russian MLRS. Now, is this Grad, is it TOS-1? I can't tell you from looking at this. Someone may be able to. But what we know is that paint by numbers, FABs, MLRS, drones, and then troops. So we see that MLRS, and then later on in the footage, we get a geolocation of a Russian flag in that area, and it lines up with what we would expect to see. Now let's have a look on then the Suryak map here, and we see further movement into Stroivka, lining up with this geolocation. But what this has done is it's then created this envelopment between Topoli and Stroivka, and then Suryak here is claiming that between Topoli and Stroivka has now met up in this sector. Of course, then shortening the front line, but also now having not only northern pushes, but your ability to push to the west as well and potentially bypass some areas. So just wait out on that. But again, what I say, Suryak is very, very reliable. Now we'll head down into the area that I've been saying for over a month concerns me the most, and we may have seen a large update here. Now, if you zoom out here, what we can see is what I refer to as the Terney front, or the Nove front. And what I've been saying is this waterway here, nothing stops ground movements like waterways. That's why there's good argument to say this war may continue to the Dnieper. To the Dnieper River. And now we see this Oskil Reservoir. And what we have seen is drone saturation within 10 kilometres is huge. And I've been saying that Kharkiv sits at about that 10 Ks, and this is the critical town in here for the Russians to get before the Ukrainians all in this sector need to really consider maybe pulling out. But what that does is it has a higher density of forces then that are going to be pushing towards Izium. Now, let's have a look on the Terney front. So we did see the other day, back on the 30th, we saw further push in the direction of Kharkiv from Nove, confirmed by Deep State Map. But Suryak maps today, he's showing this, that he's showing the last 3 days, the Russian army took full control over Rydkadab here and advanced west and north of the locality, reaching the outskirts of Kharkiv. So the outskirt of Kharkiv. In addition, Russian forces began over Zelena Dolia from the south. Again, not super focused on this area at the moment. We're more talking about Kharkiv. And if this is where it is, I think this is a huge, huge concern. So let's show you a geolocation to confirm some of this movement. Now, Kharkiv is out here. So this is Rydkadab, but it is on the western side of Rydkadab. Just there, we do see in this footage Russian forces flying a flag, confirming movement in then these locations. We can see that there, and I zoom out on the drone. But Kharkiv, I think this is a very, very critical area. It doesn't mean that this whole area will collapse. No. But it means that everything that goes into this front has to go through here, and it could turn into an absolute killing field. And what we may see, remember, attritional war is an art of its own. We potentially could see the Russians get to Kharkiv, shape it something like this, just for instance, and stop then advancing. Because if they're going, look, the cost of us to continue through is going to be massive because of drones coming this way too, okay, but there's a kilometre less range due to having to cross over water or through heavy fields, we may be able to create a kill zone in here. And we have seen that happen before, because the goal of attritional warfare is to attrit your enemy faster than your own forces. And that sometimes it may look like incorrect tactical decisions are being made, of course, to reach to here, but sometimes you may be making kill zones. Envelopments are part of that also. Now, while we're actually on this front, I want to come up into Raihodkia. This is one of these fronts that will be limited movement as well if Russia can push to Kharkiv, which it is looking likely. But Raihodkia front line, During the last week, Ukrainian army managed to recover new positions southeast of Nadia. So this sits just tiny little area just down in Nadia. It's barely located in here, but just in here, Ukraine has pushed that back. Now, we're done with Terny. Let's move our way down into the Velika Novosilka front line. So Velika Novosilka, couple of large movements in here. Zeleny Pole, Novosilka, Novopil as some of the areas we will look at first. So back on the 29th, we saw expansion around Zeleny Pole and Novosilka, still with troops encircled in here. And some tell me that, yes, this isn't cut off here, that troops are actually encircled in here. So again, wait out on that. But this movement through Novopil is likely more than this map is showing, because just in the center of Novopil, there's like 3 roads. And on the center road here, we see at that geolocation then this Russian flag going up in this footage from here to, flying the flag there. So right sort of between sort of the V and the O. So further confirming that movement. Doesn't matter. And then to the north of Velika Novosilka, we see then Syriac maps showing some more ground being made through Bahatar. Now, in my opinion, Odrane and Bahatar, these are both under Russian control. I think it's highly unlikely that they are not, given the literally 10 or 11 flags we saw go up in each location. So let's look at what Syriac says here. Now, Syriac, he's showing that this area through Zeleny Pole and Novopil, that there is no encirclement. It's just then through, okay? But what we see is then they've reached the Zap Oblast here too, at least by what Syriac is saying, which that is important as well. You can see just in here where these oblasts meet by then the checkered line. And then we see the Velika Novosilka front. Russian army took full control over the location of Vesely up here, so further expanding out to the north. But we see just, he said, Ukrainian army then entered Odrane, withdrawing from the west. So they're re-entering some of these areas. It doesn't mean that it's not under control, but it means that when it came up to here, as he claimed, that's now pushed back. We're trying to go sort of chronologically of what is happening in here. But Russian army may take full control over Novopil and Oleksivkia. So Novopil, then these areas down in here by then Syriac map, and showing that then where we're talking about Odrane is still under control, because I believe this is it here, but Ukraine has entered those western blocks of it. A lot of fluid on the front line. We expect to see this. Now let's come up into then Pokrovsk east, as we have seen this not only going out, but expanding, exactly what we'd expect to see in a war like this. It protects your own lines of communication, and of course, then reduces saturation of any weapons used against you too. So let's have a look. On the 30th, we saw Romanivka, more control here by the Russian forces, again, between Zeroya and Romanivka. Realistically, I think this is cut off in this sector. I think that's not cut off. I think it's just all red. And then further, we see down this sector in here coming red, and as well, further near Stara and Mykolaievka, down in where this grey zone is here. So again, fattening the base of that now growing chode in that sector. Let's have a look at Syriac map. So he's showing a lot more movement to the north, coming in line with then Popovya, Poltavkia, and did he say entering the outskirts of Rasanya? So Rasanya is here, where that grey zone is showing. So Syriac is suggesting, let's just be rough with this, say 4.5 kilometres more advanced, where the grey zone is showing here though, but also showing that this sector in here, this has then closed up, that around Zeroya salient, they are closing that up and conducting clearing operations, more movement in then the north the next day, and then up to the most recent, then pushing out to the west, exactly like we'd expect. You move out, fatten, move out and fatten. It doesn't mean you do that day to day, but it's what we'd expect. That around Zeroya, that this has now closed up, and that there are clashes continue at this locality too. Again, nothing surprising on this front. Now, this one here is just belt feed of other maps. Of course, we've got then the Pokrovsk front line, Udashny, Horakove, and we're looking for Toritsk in here as well. Remember, getting closer and closer to Dnipro Oblast. So let's look at Pokrovsk on this. this showed the other day, sorry, excuse my phone, Toritsk, these areas coming under Russian control or at least Russian presence in there. And then we then see on Syriac map just this area. He'd already shown that, but more filling in around this, entering Hodorkovye on just the very outskirts too. So wait out on this. Now, we'll continue our way. We have then Pokrovsk east, and then Toritsk. Sometimes I can't be bothered with it because it's so hard to know what is actually going on. On day 1191, 48 hours, Russian army made new advances near Ozarivka as well, so further out from this sector in here. You can see where the canal runs up here. This canal goes up through, Chasiv Yar. So this sector is just in here. He claims is coming under Russian control. And then furthermore, then continuing in the direction of Delivkia from here, wait out on that. Again, Toritsk is a bit of a mess to try and know. Move to the north, of course, then we have Chasiv Yar, a very, very important area, an area we don't see have much movement. But since mid-May, Russian army gradually took control over the remaining high-rise buildings in the city centre. Russian forces were able to previously lost territory in this area, and during the last days, enter the houses. 60% of Chasiv Yar is now under Russian control. So showing that all this sector in here, most of the sector up here, and pushing across that canal in some areas as well, it's coming under Russian control, but only 60%. Remember, there's still a lot in here not under control. So wait out on that. Chasiv Yar, this is an area to really hold forces and trick forces too for the Ukrainians to this, to the Russians, due to things like the canal and the high ground. But once that falls, the flat ground after that, we may see large gains. Now let's come down into the south. Now, one thing I have seen in the south is a hell of a lot of operations around Stepnohursk from glide munitions. So wait out on that. But we do have today from Syriac, Ukrainian gain in this direction. Sorry, I feel like I'm going to vomit. During this week, Ukrainian army managed to recapture a series of positions south of Kamyanske. So Kamyanske, and then we have Luhove. So down in this sector here, down to, where's this turn in the road? So below the turn in the road, probably down to here. This is where Syriac is claiming the Ukrainians have made ground. Now, again, let's talk about my criticism, which I think is completely fair, of the funding given to Ukraine from the EU, whereas there is some hypocrisy of this. But also, I want to show you something else where these numbers are slightly skewed. Because remember, the way data is presented is just as important as the data itself. From the BBC, how the West is helping Russia fund its war in Ukraine. Russia has continued to make billions from fossil fuel exports to the West. Data shows helping to finance full-scale invasion of Ukraine, now in its 4th year. Russia has made more than 3 times as much money by exporting hydrocarbons than Ukraine has received in aid allocated by its allies. And we see this chart here, that the blue is how much has been given to Ukraine, how much then fossil fuels have been sold by Russia. Now they say billions, but maybe you should say almost a trillion or hundreds of billions. You can see from NATO states, sanctioning states, and the EU. Now what you'll see in all of this is that the number is far greater in then buying from Russia than it is from Ukraine. These numbers, these sort of numbers, this looks like propaganda. It's YouTube AdSense, but you can see that it is far more, sometimes 3 times or more. But something that this gentleman here, Paul, did point out of these numbers is it's a bit misleading because this doesn't account for the almost 50 billion euros allocated by the EU Commission. It only counts aid allocated by individual EU states. This reports a total of 137 or 138 billion euros from Europe. This may include Switzerland and Norway. I don't mean to defend the EU, but it's a big pile of poop. But the chart is misleading. So what he's getting at is in some of these figures, like down in here, this is only getting taken from how you present the data. It's correct, but only from the individuals rather than the EU Commission with the further 50 billion euros on top of that. So again, the BBC is trying to make a point here with this by interpreting some of the data, okay? It's why we try our best to add nuance, but it's the reason why my videos take so long too, and I still get wrong a lot of this. Despite the West's efforts, 2024 Russian revenues from fossil fuels fell by a mere 5% compared to 23, along with a similar 6%. Last year, It's almost a 6% increase in Russian revenues from crude oil export and a 9% year-on-year increase in revenues from pipeline gas. Russian estimates say gas exports to Europe rose by 20% in 2024. What this is missing, though, and what this tells us, is that the EU, the NATO states, the world is reliant on Russian gas, that even or Russian fossil fuels, even after 3.5 years of war, that they want to sanction, they want to take away, but they can't backfill that. It's not that they're wanting to give the money to Russia. It's what we found is there's no alternative for them either. So the problem is probably worse than just they're being pricks. It's probably what is the actual alternative here. And as Europe tries to increase its industrial capacity, this is likely going to actually get worse. EU's foreign policy chief, Karen Kallas, says the alliance has not imposed the strongest sanctions on Russian oil and gas because some of its member states fear an escalation in the conflict and because buying them is cheaper in the short term. So seeing not really prepared to do it. And what I say is there's rhetoric about Russia and Putin and then the reality of how these states are acting. They say by 2027, there's a roadmap to cut off all of that. It's a long way away. The way we're seeing the war and the attritional phase, 27 to me is way too fucking late. Way too late for this war. But the end of 27, more than 2.5 years, what do you think this is going to look like by then? And again, but that's giving time for Russia to find other ways to export its fiscal reserves anyway. We'll find it with Indonesia or China or Mongolia or whatever. I'm not saying it's going to make as much, but it may still be able to sustain war. And the war by that point, if this war's still going on, yeah, it's going to look a lot worse than it is now. The thirst for fuel can get in the way of the West's efforts to limit Russia's ability to fund its war. This Maya Rosner here, the senior campaigner for pressure group at Global Witness, says there's no real desire in many governments to actually limit Russia's ability to produce and sell oil. There is way too much fear about what that would mean for global energy markets, and there's a line drawn under where energy markets would be too undermined or too thrown off kilter. And this is the problem with all of this embedded in a world economy as well. When you try and do this, it can actually have the opposite effect. Trump's oil price plan to end the war. That Mr. Milov, he says people in Moscow are laughing at this idea because the party which will suffer the most is American shale oil industry, the least competitive oil industry in the world, of trying to bring oil prices down. Now below I will tag, hopefully, but otherwise if I don't, just search William Dr. Connolly, Connelly, when speaking about this. What happens if that oil price gets dragged down? Well, okay, who do you think produces a barrel of oil cheaper, given wages, the cost of produce, all of this? The US with high wages, Russia, Saudi. The US has the least amount on top, that it costs them, say, $50 to make a barrel, and they're only selling at 60 or 70, and it's $20, where Russia and Saudi sometimes create at 20. Saudi, I've heard numbers of 6 before, so there's more on top, so it will start affecting America first. And what Dr. Connolly went over is what we could see is, and before it really starts collapsing Russia's industry, is it collapses America's industry first. He says that Russia's cost of producing crude is also lower than OPEC countries like Saudi. So they would hurt by lower oil prices before Russia. And there's no way Saudi is going to agree to that. It's been tried before, and this has led to conflict between Saudi Arabia and the US. He says there are both moral and practical issues with the West buying Russian hydrocarbons while supporting Ukraine. We now have a situation in which we are funding the aggressor in a war that we're condemning and also funding the resistance to the war. This dependence on fossil fuels means that we are really at the whims of energy markets, global energy producers, and hostile dictators. And what I will say is it's become a bit of a specialty to fund both sides of the war. But this doesn't surprise me at all. Remember, I actually spoke about this, of to bring down that OPEC plus price, what would it actually cost the US to do to Saudi Arabia? So Saudi would go, we're going to lose this much money by that dropping to that. And if the US want to do that, you're going to have to backfill our industry with your money because we're not going to do it for free. You're seeing how Saudi greet Putin? They're not going to do it for free. And what one of my guys behind the scenes says is it would cost upwards of $600 billion. The US is already unbelievably unhappy about $100 to $300 billion, more like, say, high ones going towards Ukraine. Are they going to threaten their own oil industry and pay Saudi then a remuneration of minimum of $600 billion, so almost $1 trillion to try and bring down the oil price here? No, it'd be cheaper to give a couple of bloody aircraft carriers. Anyway, legends, hope you have a fantastic end of your weekend. Thanks for sticking with me today, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.